Sabrina Vale rose slowly from the third row just as the pastor asked if anyone objected. Her champagne-colored dress shimmered under the crystal chandeliers while 200 wealthy guests turned toward her in confusion. "You can't marry Weston Hale," she said, voice shaking. "He's been sleeping with me for 3 years." The entire ballroom went silent. Weston's face drained of color. Evelyn Hale nearly dropped her wine glass. Cameras lowered, whispers spread like wildfire, but Lucille Bishop didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked at Sabrina, then reached calmly into her bouquet and pulled out a sealed envelope. "I know," she said softly, "and I've been waiting for this moment all morning. If you think this story ends with a broken bride begging for answers, keep watching. Because sometimes the woman everyone underestimates is the only one who already knows exactly how the story ends." 6 months before the wedding, Lucille Bishop stood barefoot in the kitchen of Weston Hale's penthouse at 6 in the morning, reheating coffee that had already gone cold twice. Outside the massive glass windows, Manhattan still looked half asleep. Gray skies stretched over the city while expensive buildings disappeared into low winter fog. The apartment was silent, except for the ticking of the designer clock Weston's mother had bought them after the engagement. Lucille stared at herself in the reflection of the microwave door. 33 years old, successful corporate attorney, senior associate at one of the top law firms in New York, engaged to one of the city's most admired cardiac surgeons. From the outside, her life looked perfect. That was the problem. Everyone thought she was lucky. Lucy Weston's voice drifted from the bedroom, warm and sleepy. Lucille immediately straightened. "In here." He walked into the kitchen wearing gray sweatpants and exhaustion. Even half awake, Weston Hale looked like the kind of man magazines wrote articles about. Tall, sharp jawline, calm blue eyes, the kind of polished charm that made strangers trust him instantly. He kissed her forehead distractedly while reaching for his espresso. "You're up early again," he murmured. "So are you. Double surgery today." Lucille smiled softly. "I packed your lunch." Weston barely glanced at her. "You didn't have to do that." But he took it anyway. That was their relationship lately. Lucille gave, Weston accepted. Then both pretended it was love. "You'll still make dinner with my parents tonight, right?" Weston asked while checking his phone. Lucille hesitated. She had been awake until nearly 2 in the morning preparing for a merger case at the firm. Her eyes still burned from staring at contracts for 10 straight hours. "I'll try to leave work early." Weston sighed immediately. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. "You know how important this is to my mother." Lucille swallowed the exhaustion rising in her throat. "I said I'll be there." "Good." He kissed her again and headed toward the door. "No, thank you." "No. How are you holding up?" No noticing the woman slowly collapsing beside him. The front door closed behind him. Lucille stood alone in the expensive kitchen, listening to silence fill the apartment again. Then her phone buzzed. Olivia Kent. Her best friend. "You alive?" the text read. Lucille laughed quietly despite herself. "Barely." She typed back. "Functioning." "That counts." 3 dots appeared instantly. "You haven't slept again, have you?" Lucille ignored the question because Olivia already knew the answer. By 7:30 that evening, Lucille was still sitting in her office conference room while junior associates rushed around her carrying binders and laptops. Her temples throbbed. Her engagement ring felt unusually heavy tonight. "Lucy." She looked up to see Diane Mercer leaning against the doorway. Diane was one of the most feared attorneys in Manhattan, sharp-minded, elegant, impossible to intimidate. And somehow over the years, she had become the closest thing Lucille had to a mentor. "You're still here?" Diane asked. "I'm leaving now." Diane studied her carefully. "You look exhausted." Lucille smiled automatically. Wedding planning. Diane didn't look convinced. Nobody noticed details the way Diane did. You're too young to already look emotionally defeated, Diane said calmly. Lucille laughed awkwardly. That's dramatic. No, Diane replied. It's observant. The words lingered uncomfortably. Lucille gathered her files quickly before she could think too hard about them. By the time she arrived at the Hale family estate in Connecticut, dinner had already started. Perfect. Evelyn Hale hated lateness, almost as much as she hated Lucille's middle-class upbringing. The dining room looked like something from a luxury magazine spread. Crystal glasses, white roses, candlelight glowing against silver, everything cold and beautiful. Evelyn looked up immediately. Well, she said smoothly, Lucille finally made time for us. Lucille forced a polite smile. I'm sorry. Work ran late. Richard Hale barely acknowledged her. Weston didn't defend her. Of course he didn't. Lucille sat quietly beside him while servers brought out another expensive meal she barely tasted. Conversation revolved around hospital donors, political connections, charity galas, investment portfolios. People with too much money discussing other people with too much money. Then Evelyn turned toward Lucille with that familiar smile that never reached her eyes. I still think it's admirable, she said lightly, how determined you are to keep working after the marriage. Lucille blinked. What do you mean, oh, nothing negative, Evelyn replied. It's just, Weston's lifestyle is demanding. Most women eventually prioritize family. There it was. The subtle insult hidden inside concern. Weston continued eating silently. Lucille looked at him, waiting. Nothing. Not one word. Claire Bishop used to call moments like this emotional abandonment in designer clothing. Lucille folded her napkin carefully. I enjoy my career. Evelyn smiled thinly. Of course you do. The rest of dinner passed in suffocating politeness. By dessert, Lucille felt emotionally invisible. Again. Back at the penthouse later that night, Weston loosened his tie while scrolling through emails. You were quiet tonight, he said. Lucille stared at him. You let your mother humiliate me. Weston sighed instantly. Lucy, not this again. She acts like I'm temporary. You're overthinking everything. No, Weston, I'm paying attention. That made him finally look up. For one brief second, irritation flashed across his face. Then it disappeared behind charm again. She's just protective. She doesn't respect me. You take everything personally lately. Lucille felt that familiar twisting sensation inside her chest, the strange way he could make her feel guilty for being hurt. I'm trying, she whispered. I know. But he sounded tired when he said it, not loving, tired. Weston walked toward the bathroom, pulling out his phone as he went. The screen lit up briefly in the dim apartment. One name? Sabrina. Lucille froze. A message preview appeared for less than a second. Miss you already. Her stomach dropped instantly. Weston quickly turned the screen away. Too quickly. Who's Sabrina? Lucille asked carefully. Weston didn't even pause. Hospital fundraiser. Why is she texting you at 11:30 at night? He gave a short laugh. You're interrogating me over a text. Now I asked a question. And I answered it. He disappeared into the bathroom. A moment later, the shower turned on. Lucille stood motionless in the bedroom. Something deep inside her had started whispering weeks ago. Something wasn't right. But love made people negotiate with their instincts. So she told herself she was tired, stressed, paranoid, just like Weston wanted her to believe. She climbed into bed alone nearly 40 minutes later. Weston was already asleep beside her, or pretending to be. Lucille stared at the ceiling in darkness, then quietly reached for her phone. Instagram? Search. Sabrina Vale. The profile appeared instantly. Beautiful, elegant, blonde, rich. Hospital gala photos, charity events, luxury vacations. Then Lucille's chest tightened. There was a picture from 3 months ago at a medical fundraiser. Weston stood in the background, looking at Sabrina, not casually, not professionally, intimately. The kind of look people tried to hide when they were already emotionally involved. Lucille's hands began shaking. A notification suddenly appeared across her screen. Unknown number. Her pulse stopped. One message. 6 words. Don't marry Weston Hale. Lucille stared at the screen while ice spread slowly through her entire body. And for the first time in months, she stopped telling herself everything was okay. Lucille barely slept after the message. Don't marry Weston Hale. The words replayed in her mind until sunrise painted pale gold across the bedroom walls. Beside her, Weston slept peacefully, one arm stretched across the mattress like a man with nothing to hide. That almost hurt more. The ease of him, the comfort, the absence of guilt. Lucille turned her head slowly and studied his face in silence. For 4 years she had loved this man with the kind of loyalty people wrote vows about. She had defended him during residency exhaustion, supported him through impossible surgeries, rearranged her own career around his schedule, and convinced herself emotional neglect was temporary because ambition required sacrifice. But suddenly every lonely dinner felt different. Every canceled date, every distracted kiss, every moment she had swallowed her sadness to become understanding. Maybe she hadn't been understanding. Maybe she had simply been trained not to ask for more. Weston stirred beside her. Lucille immediately locked her phone and closed her eyes. A few seconds later, she felt his lips brush her shoulder. I have an early procedure, he murmured sleepily. Okay. You all right? The question almost made her laugh, not because it sounded caring, because it sounded automatic, like something he said out of habit instead of concern. I'm fine. He nodded once and disappeared into the bathroom. Lucille opened Instagram again the second the shower started. Sabrina Vale's profile stared back at her. Elegant charity galas, luxury rooftop dinners, designer gowns, photos beside surgeons, investors, politicians, the kind of woman magazines called magnetic. Lucille hated herself for looking longer than she should. Sabrina was beautiful, not just physically, confident, effortless, like she belonged in Weston's world naturally. Unlike Lucille, who still sometimes felt like she was borrowing space inside the Hale family universe. A new photo caught her attention. Posted 2 weeks ago, hospital fundraising event. Weston stood beside Sabrina at the edge of the frame, holding a champagne glass. Neither of them touched, but they leaned toward each other instinctively, comfortably, intimately. Lucille zoomed in slowly. Weston was smiling, not the polished public smile he wore at family dinners. A real one. Her chest tightened painfully because she realized something terrifying. She hadn't seen that expression directed at her in months. That afternoon, Lucille told herself she was being irrational. People cheated in movies, in messy marriages, not in relationships like hers, not with a man everyone admired, not with Weston. So she did what emotionally exhausted women often do. She went searching for proof that she was overreacting. At lunch, she met Olivia at a quiet cafe near the law firm. The second Lucille sat down, Olivia narrowed her eyes. You look like you're about to either cry or commit arson. Lucille gave a weak laugh. Maybe both. Olivia's expression softened immediately. What happened? Lucille hesitated before sliding her phone across the table. Olivia read the anonymous message carefully, then the Instagram photos, then looked back up slowly. Oh, Lucy, maybe it's nothing. Olivia blinked. You do realize normal women would already be setting his car on fire, right? Lucille rubbed her forehead tiredly. He says she's a hospital fundraiser, and maybe this is all in my head. Olivia leaned back in disbelief. Lucille Bishop, you bill $600 an hour because you notice details nobody else notices. Stop pretending you're stupid when it comes to your own life. The words landed harder than Lucille expected, because deep down, she already knew something was wrong. She just wasn't emotionally ready for confirmation. Talk to him, Olivia said gently. And if he lies, Olivia's expression darkened. Then stop protecting a man who isn't protecting you. That evening, Lucille arrived unexpectedly at one of Weston's hospital charity events. The ballroom inside the Manhattan Medical Foundation glowed with expensive elegance. Crystal chandeliers reflected against marble floors, while donors laughed over wine and classical music drifted softly through the air. Everything looked polished, sophisticated, perfect. Exactly the kind of environment where ugly secrets survived easily. Lucille spotted Weston almost immediately, and her stomach dropped. He stood beside Sabrina near the bar. Too close. Far too close. Sabrina laughed at something he whispered, touching his arm lightly. Weston smiled down at her with easy familiarity, not professional politeness. Intimacy. Lucille froze several feet away. Neither of them had noticed her yet. Then Sabrina adjusted Weston's tie gently. A small gesture, dangerously small, but people only touched each other like that when they already belonged in each other's space. Lucille felt heat rise behind her eyes. She forced herself to walk forward calmly. Weston! Both of them turned instantly. For the first time all night, Weston looked uncomfortable. Lucy, he said quickly, I didn't know you were coming. Clearly. Sabrina recovered first. Her smile was elegant and practiced. You must be Lucille, she said warmly. I've heard so much about you. Lucille shook her hand politely. Too politely. And you're Sabrina. Something flickered briefly in Sabrina's eyes. Recognition. Awareness. As if she suddenly realized Lucille knew more than expected. Weston cleared his throat. Sabrina organizes donor relations for the foundation. It's nice to finally meet you, Sabrina said smoothly. Lucille held her gaze. Was it because something about Sabrina's expression didn't feel guilty? It felt territorial. Weston Hale suddenly appeared beside them carrying a glass of champagne. There you are, Evelyn said brightly to Sabrina before even acknowledging Lucille. I was just telling Richard you saved the entire gala. Then she turned toward Lucille. You should learn from Sabrina. She understands how important presentation is in these circles. The humiliation was subtle enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. Weston said nothing. Again. Lucille smiled mechanically while something inside her quietly cracked. The drive home was silent. Rain streaked across the windshield while Weston kept both hands tight on the steering wheel. Finally, Lucille spoke. You looked happy tonight. Weston frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean with Sabrina? Oh my God. There it was. Instant irritation. How many times are we doing this? He snapped. I'm asking because you barely looked at me all evening. You're being paranoid. Lucille stared out the window. You let your mother humiliate me again. She was making conversation. No, she was comparing me to another woman in front of you. Weston exhaled harshly. You take everything personally lately. The words hit her like cold water because suddenly she realized something horrifying. Every conversation about her pain somehow ended with her apologizing. Every time. Lucille turned toward him slowly. Are you sleeping with her? Weston laughed once in disbelief. You seriously think I'd risk our relationship over some fundraiser? He sounded offended, almost convincing. Almost, but not enough anymore. When they got home, Weston headed straight for the shower again. And 15 minutes later, while he slept beside her, Lucille quietly picked up her keys. At 11:42 p.m., Lucille sat alone in her car across the street from Mount Sinai Medical Center. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel. This was insane, pathetic, humiliating. She was a grown woman hiding in a parking lot because she no longer trusted the man she was about to marry. At midnight, Weston finally exited the hospital. Lucille's breath caught. A blonde woman walked beside him, Sabrina. Weston opened the passenger door for her. Not like co-workers, like habit, like intimacy. Lucille felt something inside her physically break. But it got worse, much worse, because instead of heading downtown toward Sabrina's apartment, Weston leaned over and kissed her. Slowly, comfortably, like this wasn't new. Lucille stopped breathing. The world outside the windshield blurred instantly. Then Weston drove away with Sabrina beside him, and for the first time since the engagement, Lucille followed him. Lucille followed Weston's black Range Rover through rain-soaked Manhattan streets until it finally stopped outside a luxury apartment tower on the Upper East Side, Sabrina's building. The realization settled into Lucille's chest like shattered glass. She parked half a block away with trembling hands and watched through blurred windows as Weston stepped out first. Sabrina laughed at something he said before he placed his hand against her lower back. The gesture destroyed her, because it was familiar. That was how Weston touched Lucille when he loved her openly. Before things became distant, before affection started feeling scheduled. Lucille sat frozen behind the steering wheel while they disappeared inside together. No hesitation, no secrecy, no guilt, like this had happened many times before. The lobby doors closed behind them, and Lucille broke. A sound escaped her throat before she could stop it, small, choked, humiliating. Her forehead dropped against the steering wheel as tears came violently and without grace. Years of exhaustion suddenly crashed into one unbearable moment. She thought betrayal would feel dramatic, explosive. Instead, it felt quiet, like realizing the person beside you stopped choosing you long ago, and you were the last one to notice. Outside rain hammered against the windshield while midnight traffic blurred into streaks of white and red. Lucille cried until her chest physically hurt. Then she wiped her face, fixed her makeup using the rearview mirror, and drove home. Because women like Lucille were taught something dangerous growing up. Be composed, be understanding, be graceful, even while your heart is bleeding. Weston came home at 3:17 a.m. Lucille knew because she was still awake in bed, pretending to sleep. He showered immediately. Of course he did. Then slipped quietly beneath the sheets beside her. His hand rested lightly against her waist. The intimacy made her stomach turn. Lucille stared into darkness, feeling emptier than she ever had in her life. Because somehow, the cheating wasn't even the most painful part. It was how normal he acted afterward. The next morning, Weston kissed her goodbye before work. "Love you," he said automatically. Lucille looked at him for a long moment. The lie sounded effortless. "I'll see you tonight," he added. Then he left. Lucille stood motionless in the apartment for several seconds after the door closed. Then she walked straight to the bathroom and vomited. 3 days later, wedding invitations were finalized. Lucille sat beside Evelyn Hale at a private luncheon while designers presented floral samples and seating charts. Everything smelled expensive: fresh roses, champagne, luxury perfume. Lucille wanted to disappear. "You look pale," Evelyn observed while reviewing invitation cards. "I'm fine." Evelyn sipped sparkling water delicately. You know marriage becomes much easier once a woman learns when silence is more valuable than emotion. Lucille looked up slowly. What does that mean? Evelyn smiled faintly. It means men under pressure need peace, not interrogation. There it was again. Always subtle, always cutting. Lucille wondered suddenly how many women Evelyn had trained herself to become over the years, how much humiliation she had swallowed to remain Mrs. Richard Hale. You raised Weston to expect obedience, Lucille said quietly. Evelyn's eyes sharpened immediately. I raised Weston to expect loyalty. Lucille almost laughed. The irony was breathtaking. But before she could answer, Weston entered the restaurant. Perfect suit, perfect smile, perfect liar. There are my girls, he said warmly. Lucille physically flinched at the phrase. Her girls, as if both women in his life existed for his comfort. Weston kissed Lucille's cheek before sitting beside her casually. His phone buzzed moments later. Lucille saw it instantly. Sabrina. Again. Weston declined the call immediately. Too quickly. Evelyn noticed. And to Lucille's shock, Evelyn didn't look confused. She looked annoyed. Not surprised, not concerned. Annoyed. The realization sent coldness spreading through Lucille's entire body. Evelyn knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand. Enough to stay silent. Enough to keep planning the wedding anyway. Lucille suddenly couldn't breathe properly. Excuse me, she whispered before standing abruptly. She walked quickly through the restaurant toward the hallway bathroom's heels clicking sharply against marble floors. Inside the empty restroom, she gripped the sink tightly. Her reflection stared back at her. Perfect hair, diamond ring, dead eyes. A soft knock sounded behind her. Claire Bishop entered moments later. Lucille's younger sister took one look at her face and frowned. Oh no. Lucille immediately looked away. I'm okay. Don't do that with me. Claire closed the door behind her carefully. What happened? Lucille stayed silent too long, and Claire understood instantly. Her expression hardened. It's Weston, isn't it? Lucille's throat tightened painfully. He's cheating on me. Saying it aloud made it real. Claire cursed under her breath. I knew something was wrong. Lucille laughed weakly through tears. Apparently everyone did except me. Claire stepped closer immediately. Lucy, no, it's embarrassing, Lucille whispered. I'm a lawyer. I build entire careers noticing manipulation and loopholes and lies, but somehow I kept defending him. Because you loved him. Lucille shook her head slowly. No, because I kept making excuses for him. The difference suddenly mattered. A lot. Claire crossed her arms tightly. So what are you going to do? Lucille opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because she honestly didn't know. Cancel the wedding, confront him, expose him, pretend ignorance. Every option felt catastrophic. I feel stupid, Lucille admitted quietly. Claire's face softened instantly. You are not stupid for believing someone who promised to love you. Lucille finally started crying again. Small tears this time. Exhausted tears. I don't even recognize myself anymore. Claire reached for her hands. That's because you disappear around him. The words hit brutally hard, because they were true. Lucille had spent years becoming smaller to make Weston comfortable, less emotional, less demanding, less complicated, less herself. And somehow even that hadn't been enough to keep him faithful. That night, Weston arrived home carrying Lucille's favorite takeout from the Italian restaurant near her office. The gesture almost made her angry, not because it was cruel, because it was strategic. Weston always became affectionate whenever he sensed her pulling away emotionally. You've been distant lately, he said, while unpacking food containers. Lucille stared at him from across the kitchen island. I've been tired. You're overworking yourself again. The audacity nearly took her breath away. He really believed her pain existed independently from him. Weston stepped closer and touched her waist gently. We're almost through the stressful part, he murmured. After the wedding, things will calm down. Lucille looked up into his familiar blue eyes, the eyes she once trusted completely. How long have you been sleeping with her? Weston immediately went still, only for a second. But Lucille caught it. Then his expression hardened slightly. I'm not doing this tonight. Answer me. There's nothing to answer. You were at her apartment. Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. Weston pulled his hand away slowly. You followed me. The shift happened instantly, not guilt, anger, as if her discovering the betrayal somehow violated him more than the betrayal itself. Lucille stared at him in disbelief. You cheated on me. You invaded my privacy. The manipulation was so immediate it almost impressed her. Lucille laughed once, a broken sound. Oh my God! Weston ran a hand through his hair impatiently. Sabrina and I... The hesitation confirmed everything. Lucille felt her heart harden slightly inside her chest. Finally. She means nothing, he finished quickly. Nothing! The word echoed violently through Lucille's mind. Because women were always nothing once men got caught. Nothing despite years. Nothing despite intimacy. Nothing despite betrayal. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. If Sabrina meant nothing, what did that make Lucille? Weston stepped closer again. Lucy, look at me. She didn't. I love you. But this time, Lucille noticed something she had missed for years. Weston always said I love you most urgently after hurting her. As if love were damage control. As if the words existed to erase consequences. Lucille slowly stepped backward, away from his touch, away from his comfort, away from the version of herself that kept accepting less than she deserved. Weston's expression darkened slightly. Don't make this bigger than it is. And there it was, the sentence that changed everything. Because suddenly, Lucille realized something terrifying. To Weston, her heartbreak was merely an inconvenience. 3 weeks after Lucille discovered the affair, Weston acted like nothing had happened. That was the most psychologically exhausting part. Not the cheating, not even the lies, the normalcy. He still kissed her goodbye every morning, still asked what she wanted for dinner, still discussed honeymoon resorts while texting another woman behind closed doors. As if Lucille's pain existed in a separate room he never had to enter. And somehow, everyone around them kept participating in the performance. Especially the Hale family, especially Evelyn. By the second week of April, wedding planning had become a full-time emotional prison. Every floral arrangement, every seating chart, every expensive tasting dinner felt grotesque now. Lucille sat silently through most of it, watching Weston perform devotion for the world while emotionally abandoning her in private. Then the prenup arrived. 47 pages. Delivered in a leather folder by one of Richard Hale's attorneys like a corporate acquisition contract. Lucille stared at it across the conference table inside Hale Medical Group headquarters, while Richard adjusted his cufflinks calmly. We'd like this finalized quickly, Richard said. Of course he would. Lucille opened the document slowly. At first glance it looked standard. Then she started reading carefully, and the deeper she went, the colder she became. In the event of divorce, Weston retained primary ownership of all marital property investments. Lucille waived claims to future hospital expansion profits. Lucille forfeited rights to several shared real estate assets, Confidentiality clauses restricted public disclosures. Infidelity language applied only to public scandal, not private affairs. Lucille reread that section twice. Her pulse slowed dangerously. This wasn't protection. This was strategy. Weston sat beside her, casually checking emails while she reviewed the document that could financially bury her later. "You okay?" he asked lightly. Lucille looked at him carefully. "You already signed this?" "Yeah. No hesitation. No shame." "You agree with all of it?" Weston leaned back in his chair. "It's just legal protection. For who?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Lucy, don't start. Don't start." The phrase ignited something sharp inside her chest, because somehow every concern she had became an inconvenience to him. Lucille closed the folder carefully. "This document assumes our marriage will fail." Richard gave a small corporate smile. "All marriages involving wealth require planning. Wealth, not love, not partnership. Wealth." Lucille suddenly understood something horrifying. The Hale family didn't view marriage emotionally. They viewed it structurally, like an asset merger. And she was the asset being evaluated. "I'd like my attorney to review this," Lucille said calmly. Richard's expression shifted immediately. "That won't be necessary." Lucille met his gaze evenly. "Yes, it will." For the first time all meeting, Weston looked irritated. "Lucy, this doesn't need to become dramatic." The audacity almost made her laugh. He cheated on her for years, and somehow she was still the one accused of creating drama. Lucille stood slowly. "I'll have feedback by next week." Then she walked out before either man could stop her. Diane Mercer read the prenup in complete silence, which terrified Lucille more than anger would have. The two women sat in Diane's office overlooking downtown Manhattan while evening sunlight painted gold across shelves of legal awards and framed victories. Finally, Diane removed her glasses carefully. "How long has Weston been cheating?" Lucille blinked. You knew Diane gave her a flat look. "Lucille, I negotiate billion-dollar divorces for sport. Men prepare contracts like this when they're already planning exits." The humiliation burned instantly. Lucille looked away. "It's been going on for years." Diane leaned back slowly. "And he still expects you to sign this, yes?" "And marry him? Yes." Diane stared at her for a long moment, then softly asked, "Why are you still considering it?" The question cracked something open inside Lucille, because she didn't actually know anymore. Love, fear, pride, embarrassment, maybe all of it. "He keeps acting like it's fixable," Lucille whispered. Diane's expression softened slightly. "No, sweetheart. He keeps acting like you'll tolerate it." The words landed brutally hard because they were true. Lucille had spent years confusing endurance with love. Diane tapped the prenup. "A loving man doesn't prepare for your destruction." Silence filled the office. Heavy, honest. Lucille felt tears threaten again, but she swallowed them back. She was tired of crying over someone who slept peacefully beside betrayal. "What do I do?" she asked quietly. Diane folded her hands. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether you want to save the relationship," Diane said carefully, "or save yourself." Lucille stopped breathing for a second, because nobody had framed it that way before. Save the relationship, or save yourself. And suddenly she realized those things were no longer the same. That night, Lucille returned home later than usual. Weston stood in the kitchen pouring wine when she entered. "You ignored my calls. I was working." Weston studied her carefully. Something about Lucille had changed lately. He could feel it. The softness was disappearing. "Did you review the prenup?" "Yes." And Lucille placed her purse down calmly. "It's aggressive." Weston sighed immediately. "It's standard." "No, Weston, it's designed." His expression hardened slightly. "You're overanalyzing this." Lucille almost smiled. Of course he'd say that to a lawyer. She moved toward the refrigerator slowly. "What happens if I refuse to sign?" Weston laughed once under his breath. "Seriously, I asked a question." Weston set his wine glass down harder than necessary. "Why are you making everything difficult lately?" There it was again. Not concern, frustration. Because she was no longer quietly cooperating. Lucille turned toward him. "I know about the hospital expansion deal." Weston froze. "Only briefly. But enough. Interesting." "You've been using my firm connections?" she continued softly. "That's not true. You pushed this engagement announcement right before merger negotiations started." "That's coincidence." "No," Lucille said calmly. "That's timing." Weston stared at her now with unfamiliar caution. For the first time in years, he looked like he realized she was paying attention. "You're spiraling," he said finally. Lucille almost laughed again. Gaslighting sounded pathetic once you stopped emotionally needing the liar. Weston stepped closer. "Lucy, I love you." The sentence felt hollow now, mechanical, strategic. She wondered how many times he'd rehearsed it before walking into rooms where he needed control. Lucille looked at the man she once planned forever around, and suddenly she saw him clearly. Not powerful, not untouchable, just selfish. A man accustomed to women absorbing damage quietly. Weston reached for her hand. "You're exhausted. Let's just get through the wedding." The wedding. As if marriage itself would erase betrayal. Lucille let him hold her hand for exactly 3 seconds. Then she slowly pulled away, and something cold settled peacefully inside her chest for the first time. Not heartbreak. Clarity. Weston noticed the shift immediately. Lucille. But she was already walking toward the bedroom. At the doorway, she paused without turning around. "If people want a performance," she said quietly, "maybe I should give them one." Weston frowned. "What does that mean?" Lucille finally looked back at him and smiled. Not warmly, not lovingly, just enough to make him uncomfortable. "You'll find out." Then she closed the bedroom door behind her, and for the first time since discovering the affair, Lucille stopped thinking like a devastated bride and started thinking like an attorney preparing a case. Lucille stopped crying 2 days later, not because the pain disappeared, because something else replaced it. Focus. The emotional fog that had surrounded her for months began clearing with terrifying speed once she accepted one brutal truth: Weston was never going to confess voluntarily. He was going to lie until the wedding day, and if she allowed it, he would spend the rest of their marriage teaching her to doubt her own instincts. That realization changed everything. By Monday morning, Lucille had created a private encrypted folder on her laptop labeled Case File. The irony almost amused her. Inside it, she started organizing everything: screenshots, financial documents, call records, timeline notes, dates Weston claimed he was working late, dates he disappeared, dates Sabrina posted photos from locations Weston had supposedly never visited. Lucille approached the situation the same way she approached corporate litigation. Emotion second, facts first. And facts were harder to manipulate. "Tell me exactly what outcome you want." Diane Mercer sat across from Lucille in a quiet private dining room after work, reviewing printed copies of financial agreements. Lucille stirred her untouched coffee slowly. "I don't know anymore." "Yes, you do." Lucille looked up tiredly. Diane's gaze remained calm but sharp. "You're past confusion now," Diane continued. "This is strategy phase. Strategy phase. God!" Her engagement sounded like a criminal investigation. Lucille exhaled slowly. "I want to protect myself." "Good. I don't want them destroying me financially. They won't." Diane slid several folders across the table. "Move your personal assets immediately. Separate accounts. Update beneficiary structures. Secure every document before they realize you're no longer emotionally compliant." Emotionally compliant. The phrase lingered heavily, because that was exactly what the Hale family expected from her. Compliance. Pretty silence. Cooperation. Diane leaned forward slightly. "And Lucille?" "Yes. Do not underestimate wealthy men who think they're losing control of a woman." A chill crawled down Lucille's spine. "Weston isn't dangerous." Diane gave her a long look. "No, but entitled people become unpredictable when consequences finally arrive." That night, Lucille sat quietly in the penthouse living room while Weston moved around the kitchen talking about wedding seating arrangements. She watched him carefully now, not emotionally, clinically. It was astonishing how different a person looked once love stopped blinding you. Weston poured himself whiskey while speaking casually. "My mother wants Senator Rollins closer to the front tables." Lucille nodded absent-mindedly. "And Richard invited 3 additional hospital investors." Of course he did. Everything about this wedding was business disguised as romance. Weston finally glanced toward her. "You've been weird lately." Lucille almost smiled. Weird. Not heartbroken. Not betrayed. Weird. Maybe I'm stressed. Weston relaxed immediately at that answer. Stress he understood. Pain he dismissed. His phone buzzed moments later against the marble counter. Weston checked it quickly. Lucille noticed the micro-expression immediately. Softness. The kind he no longer gave her. He turned the screen face down. Too late. Sabrina. Again? Lucille watched him type a fast response before locking the phone. Then Weston looked back at her casually. "What?" "Nothing. And for the first time in years." Lucille lied back effortlessly. Over the next 2 weeks, Lucille transformed quietly. Externally, she became calmer, kinder, more agreeable. Internally, she became almost frighteningly observant. She noticed everything now. The exact tone Weston used when speaking to Sabrina privately in hallways during hospital events. How he suddenly guarded his phone charger like state secrets. How Evelyn kept monitoring Lucille's emotional reactions carefully, as if checking whether she still remained manageable. Most importantly, Lucille noticed Weston had stopped seeing her as a threat entirely. That was his biggest mistake. Because men like Weston only became cautious around emotional women, not calm ones, and Lucille had become very calm. One Thursday evening, Lucille attended a hospital donor cocktail event alone while Weston finished surgery upstairs. The rooftop venue overlooked Manhattan, glittering beneath spring rain. Champagne glasses clinked softly around her while wealthy donors floated through conversations about philanthropy and stock markets. Then Lucille saw Sabrina standing alone near the balcony, beautiful as always, elegant black dress, diamond earrings. Completely unaware, Lucille had already learned nearly everything. For a brief moment, Lucille simply watched her. And strangely, she didn't feel hatred. Not fully, because Sabrina didn't look like a victorious mistress. She looked emotionally invested, which meant Weston had lied to both of them. Interesting. Sabrina turned suddenly and froze upon seeing Lucille approaching. "Oh." Lucille smiled politely. "Hi, Sabrina. Hi." Tension thickened instantly. Sabrina recovered quickly, lifting her champagne glass slightly. You're here alone. So are you. A pause. Sharp, careful. Lucille studied her face quietly. You love him, don't you? The question visibly shocked Sabrina. What, you heard me? Sabrina laughed awkwardly. I think you're confused. No, Lucille said softly. I think you are. For the first time, Sabrina looked uncertain, and Lucille realized something important. Sabrina genuinely believed Weston would eventually choose her, which meant he'd made promises, many promises. How long has he been telling you the wedding is temporary? Lucille asked calmly. Sabrina's expression cracked slightly, just slightly. Enough. Lucille almost pitied her. Almost. Before Sabrina could answer, Weston appeared across the rooftop. The second he saw them together, genuine panic flashed across his face. Interesting again. Weston crossed the room quickly. Lucy. His voice sounded too controlled. Too careful. We were just talking, Lucille said pleasantly. Sabrina stepped back immediately. I should go. No, Lucille replied smoothly. Stay. Weston's jaw tightened. The three of them stood beneath glowing rooftop lights, while Manhattan sparkled below like another universe entirely. Lucille suddenly realized how absurd this all was. 3 adults standing inside a luxury fantasy built entirely on lies. You know what's funny, Lucille said quietly. Neither of them answered. I used to think love made people honest. Weston stepped closer carefully. Lucy, let's not do this here. Do this. As if the problem was her reaction instead of his betrayal. Lucille looked directly at Sabrina. He told you he'd leave me eventually, didn't he, Silence? Then Sabrina whispered, yes. There it was. Truth. Simple. Ugly. Weston immediately stepped in. It's complicated. Lucille laughed softly. No, actually, it's embarrassingly simple. Weston lowered his voice sharply. We're leaving. Lucille looked at him. Really looked at him. At the entitlement, the control, the expectation that he could still direct everyone emotionally. Then something almost peaceful settled inside her chest. Because suddenly she knew exactly how this story would end. Not with screaming, not with begging, with exposure, public, precise, unforgettable. Later that night, after Weston fell asleep beside her, Lucille sat alone in the dark living room with her laptop open. She created one final folder. Wedding Day. Then she typed carefully beneath it, if Sabrina wants the truth badly enough to destroy a wedding for it, maybe I should let her. Lucille stared at the sentence for a long time, then slowly smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because she was happy, because she finally stopped being afraid. Her phone buzzed suddenly. Unknown number. Lucille opened the message immediately. Sabrina, he says he loves you. Lucille typed back calmly, that's the problem. Then after a pause, she sent one more message. The wedding date. The venue. The exact ceremony time. 3 dots appeared instantly on the screen. Then Sabrina replied, he's mine. I'm coming. Lucille leaned back slowly into the darkness. Perfect. The rehearsal dinner took place at Blackstone Country Club 3 nights before the wedding. Everything about the evening screamed old money. Crystal chandeliers hung above white linen tables. A live jazz quartet played near the marble staircase while servers floated through the ballroom, carrying champagne and tiny gold-trimmed appetizers no one actually ate. The Hale family loved elegance the way some people loved oxygen. Not because it meant beauty, because it meant status. Lucille stood near the entrance in a dark emerald dress while guests admired her engagement ring and called her the luckiest woman in Manhattan. Every compliment felt like mockery now. You look stunning. Lucille turned to find Olivia approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. Olivia's expression softened immediately the second their eyes met. "You okay?" Lucille accepted the glass carefully. "I'm functioning. That's not the same thing." No, Lucille admitted quietly. "It isn't." Across the ballroom, Weston laughed beside several hospital board members, while Richard Hale proudly introduced him like a future political candidate instead of a son. Perfect smile, perfect posture, perfect performance. Lucille watched him charm the room effortlessly. It was almost impressive how naturally dishonest people adapted to admiration. "You're staring," Olivia murmured. Lucille looked away. "I used to think confidence was attractive. And now," Lucille took a slow sip of champagne, "now I think consistency is." Olivia squeezed her hand briefly. "Just survive tonight." Lucille almost smiled. Oh, she planned to do much more than survive. An hour later, Lucille sat through dinner while Evelyn Hale dominated conversation from the center of the table like a queen reviewing subjects. "You know," Evelyn said smoothly to the guests nearby, "marrying into a family like ours takes adjustment." Lucille already recognized the tone, danger wrapped in politeness. One guest laughed lightly. "Lucille seems to fit perfectly." Evelyn smiled without warmth. "She's learning." There it was, tiny humiliation, public enough to sting, subtle enough to deny. Weston continued eating. Of course he did. Lucille studied him quietly from across the candlelit table. The old version of herself would have searched his face desperately for support. This version didn't bother, because she finally understood something painful. A man who watches you drown emotionally without intervening is not neutral. He's participating. Richard raised a wine glass suddenly. "To family legacy." Everyone echoed the toast. Lucille almost laughed at the wording. Legacy. Not love. Never love. Later that evening, Lucille stepped outside onto the country club terrace for air. The night was cool and heavy with summer humidity. Music drifted faintly through open ballroom doors behind her, while distant city lights shimmered across the golf course below. For a brief moment, silence felt merciful. Then she heard Weston's voice, sharp, urgent. Lucille moved instinctively toward the corner of the terrace, hidden behind stone columns, and froze. Sabrina stood there in a silver dress, beautiful, furious. Weston looked panicked. "What are you doing here?" he hissed. "You stopped answering me. This isn't the place." Sabrina laughed bitterly. "Oh, I think this is exactly the place." Lucille remained perfectly still behind the column. Weston ran a hand through his hair aggressively. "I told you I'd handle this. You've been saying that for 2 years. 2 years." Lucille closed her eyes briefly. Jesus. Sabrina stepped closer to him. "You promised me you loved me." "I do." The words landed like knives, despite everything Lucille already knew. Weston lowered his voice further. "But timing matters. Timing. Not morality, not honesty, timing." "You're really marrying her," Sabrina whispered. "It's complicated." "No," Sabrina snapped. "You made me believe she was temporary." Silence. Then Weston said quietly, "She was supposed to be—" Lucille stopped breathing. The sentence shattered something final inside her. Not because it surprised her anymore, because of how casually he said it. Like her life, her love, her future had merely been a placeholder. Sabrina's eyes filled with tears. "You said after the merger, I know what I said. You slept in my bed 3 nights ago." Weston looked around nervously. "Keep your voice down." The humiliation of him, still worried about appearances. Always appearances. Lucille suddenly felt strangely calm. Not numb, not broken. Clear. Like her grief had burned itself out completely. Weston reached for Sabrina's wrist. Listen to me carefully. After the wedding settles down, Sabrina yanked away. You're a coward. Then she stormed back inside. Weston remained alone on the terrace for several seconds with his head lowered. For the first time since Lucille met him, he looked weak, not powerful, not charming, just pathetic. Lucille quietly stepped backward before he noticed her, and when she returned to the ballroom, she was smiling. An hour later, guests gathered near the stage for speeches and toasts. Weston wrapped an arm around Lucille's waist while photographers snapped pictures. She almost admired his commitment to the performance. Happy, he whispered against her ear. Lucille looked at him slowly. Very. Weston smiled, relieved by the answer. He had no idea what it actually meant. Richard gave a short speech first about prestige family and building a future worthy of the Hale name. Then Evelyn spoke emotionally about welcoming Lucille into the family. Lucille nearly choked on the irony. Finally, Olivia nudged Lucille gently. Your turn. The ballroom quieted as Lucille stepped onto the stage holding a champagne glass. 200 faces turned toward her. Weston watched proudly from below, still confident, still comfortable. Lucille looked around the room slowly, at the politicians, the surgeons, the investors, the women smiling politely through their own miserable marriages. Then she lifted her glass. When I met Weston, she began softly, I thought love meant commitment. The room listened carefully. Lucille smiled faintly. I thought it meant honesty, loyalty, choosing each other every day even when life became difficult. Weston's smile faltered slightly. Interesting. Lucille continued calmly, but lately I've realized something. Silence spread through the ballroom. People don't reveal who they are during easy moments. Her eyes drifted toward Weston deliberately. They reveal themselves when they believe you'll never leave. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Weston shifted subtly beside his father. Lucille kept smiling, and sometimes she said gently, the most dangerous thing a person can do is mistake kindness for weakness. Now the room felt tense, sharp, electric. Evelyn's expression tightened instantly. Lucille raised her champagne glass higher. So here's to truth. Weston stared at her carefully now. And to consequences. A strange silence followed the toast before guests slowly clapped uncertainly. Lucille stepped off stage gracefully. Weston caught her arm immediately. What was that supposed to mean? Lucille looked up at him calmly. You tell me. For the first time in years? Weston looked nervous, really nervous, and suddenly Lucille understood something important. Men like Weston never fear emotional women. They fear emotionally detached ones. Because once a woman stops begging for love, she becomes unpredictable. Weston searched her face carefully. Lucy. But before he could continue, his phone vibrated again in his pocket. Sabrina. Lucille saw the name appear, and so did he. A crack of panic flashed across his expression instantly. Lucille smiled softly. There it is. Fear. Finally. Weston quickly silenced the phone, but it was too late. The balance inside the relationship had shifted. Completely. And for the first time since the betrayal began, Lucille realized she was no longer the one trapped inside it. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in gray skies and absolute silence. Lucille woke before sunrise inside the bridal suite at Blackstone Estate and stared at the ceiling for several minutes without moving. Today. The word felt strange now, not romantic, not hopeful, final. Outside the tall windows, mist rolled slowly across the private gardens, while staff members hurried across the estate, preparing for the ceremony that society magazines would later call the wedding of the season. Lucille sat up slowly. Her engagement ring caught the pale morning light. For a moment she simply looked at it. How many women had mistaken diamonds for security? How many had worn beautiful things while quietly disappearing inside themselves? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Claire entered carrying coffee and immediately paused. "You didn't sleep." Lucille accepted the cup carefully. "No." Claire shut the door behind her. The room smelled faintly of hairspray, white roses, and expensive perfume. Wedding gowns hung near the mirrors like ghosts waiting patiently. Claire studied her sister's face. "It's not too late to walk away." Lucille stared down into the coffee, then quietly said, "Today ends one way or another." Claire's expression tightened. "You scare me when you sound calm like that." Lucille almost smiled. A month ago she would have been terrified too. Now fear felt exhausted. By 9 o'clock, the bridal suite transformed into controlled chaos. Hairstylists, makeup artists, photographers, champagne glasses, bridesmaids laughing too loudly to hide nerves. Everything moved around Lucille like a performance she no longer emotionally belonged to. Olivia sat beside her while makeup brushes swept softly across Lucille's face. "You're doing that thing again," Olivia murmured. "What thing looking emotionally detached from your own life?" Lucille looked at her reflection in the mirror. The makeup artist had made her look breathtaking, elegant, timeless, untouchable. The kind of bride people envied instantly. Funny, nobody ever asked beautiful women if they were happy. "You know what's strange?" Lucille asked softly. Olivia glanced at her. "I used to think weddings were about love." And now Lucille watched herself carefully in the mirror. "Now I think they're mostly about performance." Olivia's eyes filled briefly with sadness. "Lucy, I'm okay." It wasn't true, but it also wasn't entirely false anymore. Because somewhere between heartbreak and rage, Lucille had become emotionally sharp, clear, focused. The door suddenly opened again. Evelyn Hale entered wearing pale silver silk and diamonds that probably cost more than Lucille's first apartment. The room shifted instantly. Evelyn carried power the way some women carried perfume, subtly, aggressively. "You look lovely," Evelyn said smoothly. "Not warm, never warm, just sufficient. Thank you." Evelyn stepped closer, adjusting part of Lucille's veil delicately. "Big day," she murmured. Lucille met her eyes through the mirror. "Yes, it is." For one strange second, neither woman looked away, and Lucille wondered if Evelyn sensed something changing underneath the surface. Maybe she did, because Evelyn's next words came slower. "Marriage requires emotional discipline, Lucille." There it was again. Control disguised as wisdom. Lucille smiled faintly. "Does honesty require discipline too?" Evelyn's hand paused briefly against the veil, then continued adjusting fabric smoothly. "You'll understand eventually," Evelyn said quietly. No, Lucille thought. "I finally do understand. That was the problem." Meanwhile, across the estate, Weston stood inside the groom's suite, laughing with hospital colleagues while bourbon glasses clinked around him. To everyone else, he looked relaxed, confident, victorious. Only Noah Bennett noticed otherwise. "You look nervous," Noah said casually. Weston adjusted his cufflinks. "Big day." Noah studied him carefully. Noah had known Lucille since law school, long before Weston entered her life, long before she started shrinking herself emotionally to fit inside someone else's expectations. "You sure about this?" Noah asked quietly. Weston frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Noah shrugged. "You don't look like a man excited to marry the love of his life." The comment landed harder than expected. Weston immediately looked away. Interesting. Noah noticed that too. But before either man could continue, Richard Hale entered the room. "Ceremony starts in 40 minutes, Richard announced. Weston straightened instantly. Performance mode activated again. Noah watched silently, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain yet, he suddenly felt deeply uneasy. At 11:15, Lucille finally put on the wedding dress. The room fell silent instantly. Even Olivia covered her mouth emotionally. The gown was stunning. Classic ivory silk, off-the-shoulder neckline, long cathedral train. Elegant enough to belong in old Hollywood. Lucille stared at herself in the mirror while photographers captured the moment from every angle. She looked like a woman stepping into this happiest day of her life. Only she knew it was actually a funeral, not for the relationship, for the version of herself who kept begging to be chosen. Claire stepped beside her quietly. "You still have time?" Lucille looked at her reflection one final time. "No," she whispered softly. "He already ran out of time." Guests filled the outdoor ceremony garden beneath enormous white floral arches overlooking the estate lake. String quartets played softly while wealthy guests whispered about politics, business deals, and honeymoon destinations. Everything looked cinematic, perfect. Exactly the kind of wedding people posted online with captions about soulmates. Weston waited at the altar in a black tuxedo while cameras flashed around him, confident again, smiling again. Lucille wondered briefly if he actually believed he'd survive this. Then the music changed. Everyone stood. The garden doors opened slowly, and Lucille appeared. A collective breath moved through the crowd instantly. She walked forward with calm elegance, beneath thousands of white roses, while sunlight finally broke through clouds overhead. Beautiful, composed, untouchable. Weston's expression softened with visible relief the second he saw her approaching, as if some part of him feared she wouldn't come. Lucille almost pitied him. Almost. When she reached the altar, Weston took her hands gently. "You're incredible," he whispered. The lie sounded automatic now. Lucille simply smiled. Pastor Raymond Ellis began the ceremony warmly while guests listened emotionally. Marriage, commitment, trust. The irony nearly suffocated her. Lucille barely heard most of it. Because her attention shifted suddenly toward the back rows, a blonde woman had just entered the garden. Sabrina, wearing champagne silk, eyes locked directly onto Weston. Lucille felt him tense instantly beside her. Tiny reaction, but devastating. He knew. Oh God. He knew exactly why Sabrina came. Panic flashed across his face for the first time all day. Lucille remained perfectly still. This was it. The moment everything finally collapsed. Pastor Raymond smiled gently as the ceremony continued. Then finally came the line Lucille had replayed in her mind for weeks. "If anyone objects to this union..." Weston's grip tightened painfully around Lucille's hands. "Speak now." Silence. Heavy. Electric. Lucille watched Sabrina rise slowly from the third row, and across the garden Weston Hale finally looked afraid. Sabrina Vale stood slowly beneath the white floral archway, while 200 guests turned toward her in confusion. The wind shifted softly through the garden. Crystal glasses stopped moving. The string quartet faltered into silence. And Lucille watched Weston's entire body go rigid beside her. "You can't marry him," Sabrina said, voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's been sleeping with me for 3 years." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Someone dropped a champagne glass near the back rows. Weston's hand immediately released Lucille's. Interesting. Not comfort, not reassurance. Instinctive self-preservation. Excuse me, Pastor Raymond said cautiously. Weston stepped forward instantly. This is insane! Sabrina laughed bitterly. No! What's insane is standing here pretending to be a faithful man while I still have your messages from last night. Murmurs exploded across the ceremony. Guests leaned toward each other, whispering frantically while cameras lifted again, like predators smelling blood. Evelyn Hale rose sharply from the front row. This woman is unstable, she snapped. Security. No, Sabrina interrupted loudly. You knew about me. Silence crashed through the garden. Evelyn froze. Only for a second. But everyone saw it. Richard Hale stood immediately now, face darkening with fury. This ceremony is over. No, Lucille said softly. The single word stopped everyone. Weston turned toward her quickly. Lucy. She finally looked at him fully, and for the first time since he met her, Weston looked genuinely unsure of her. Lucille turned calmly toward Sabrina. How long the question visibly shocked everyone, including Sabrina. How long have you been with him? Weston stepped closer urgently. Lucy, don't do this. She ignored him completely. Sabrina swallowed hard. 3 years. 3 years. Nearly the entire engagement. Lucille nodded slowly as though confirming information she already possessed. Because she was. And he told you he loved you? Lucille asked. Yes. And he promised he'd leave me eventually. Sabrina's expression shifted immediately. Confusion. Suspicion. How did you... He said after the hospital merger, Lucille continued quietly. Now Sabrina stared at her in horror. Weston looked like someone watching a building collapse around him. Lucille, he hissed warningly, but she was done protecting him. Finally, Sabrina looked between them uncertainly. You knew. Lucille held her gaze steadily. For weeks. The entire garden went silent again. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. What Weston whispered. Lucille slowly turned toward him. Oh, Weston, she said softly. Did you really think I was the only woman you were lying to? Sabrina's face drained of color. You told her no, Lucille replied calmly. You did. Weston stepped forward quickly, lowering his voice. We need to handle this privately. Privately, of course, because men like Weston only valued privacy once consequences arrived publicly. Lucille almost smiled. No, she said quietly. I don't think we do. Evelyn moved toward the altar now in visible panic. Lucille, enough? Enough. Such an interesting word. As if humiliation had limits only when it affected powerful people. Lucille looked down at the wedding bouquet in her hands. White roses, perfectly arranged, carefully controlled, just like everything else in this family. Then slowly, she reached inside the bouquet and removed a sealed ivory envelope. Confusion spread visibly through the crowd. Weston stopped breathing, because suddenly he understood. This wasn't chaos. This was preparation. You knew she was coming, he whispered. Lucille looked directly at him. Yes. A photographer near the front accidentally snapped another picture. The sound echoed through the silence. Sabrina stared at Lucille in disbelief. You invited me. Lucille tilted her head slightly. I gave you the truth. What you did with it was your decision. Weston ran a hand through his hair violently now. This is unbelievable. No, Lucille said softly. What's unbelievable is how long I kept convincing myself you loved me. Something in her voice changed then. Not louder, more dangerous. Because for the first time all day, Lucille sounded completely emotionally detached. And Weston finally realized he no longer controlled the narrative. He stepped closer desperately. Lucy, please. Please. Interesting. He finally sounded human once his reputation entered danger. Lucille looked down briefly at the massive diamond engagement ring on her finger, then back at him. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she asked quietly. Weston's face tightened. "Not the cheating." The guests listened in absolute silence now. "Not even the lying." Lucille's eyes glistened, but her voice remained terrifyingly calm. "It's how easily you came home afterward and acted like I was still the woman you respected." Weston swallowed hard. "Lucy, you kissed me after sleeping with her." Sabrina visibly flinched beside the aisle. "You looked me in the eyes and talked about forever while planning another life behind my back." Weston lowered his voice urgently. "I made mistakes." Lucille laughed softly. The sound broke hearts instantly. "No, Weston. Mistakes are accidents." Her gaze sharpened. "You built an entire double life." Silence. Heavy. Brutal. Evelyn stepped forward again. "This conversation is inappropriate." Lucille turned slowly toward her future mother-in-law. "Inappropriate." Her voice remained eerily composed. "You let me sit at your dinner table while your son cheated on me for years." Evelyn's face hardened. "That is not what happened. You knew." The accusation cracked through the garden sharply. Evelyn straightened immediately. "I protected my family, and there it was. Honesty. Finally." Lucille smiled sadly. "At the cost of mine?" Weston looked desperate now. Actually desperate. Not polished, not charming, just frightened. "Lucy, listen to me carefully," he said quickly. "I love you." Sabrina meant nothing. Sabrina stared at him like she'd been slapped. Lucille almost pitied her again. Almost. Because suddenly both women could see the same thing clearly. Weston told whichever lie benefited him most in the moment. To Lucille, "You're imagining things." To Sabrina, "You're the real future." To himself, "I'll never lose either woman." Classic. Sabrina's eyes filled with tears instantly. "You told me you loved me." Weston snapped toward her. "I do." Then toward Lucille again. But Lucille actually laughed this time. A real laugh. Small. Disbelieving. You can't even keep your lies organized anymore. Several guests looked away awkwardly. Others openly stared now, completely absorbed. Because this no longer looked like scandal. It looked like reckoning. Lucille held the envelope carefully between both hands. Weston noticed immediately, and panic flooded his face again. "What's in that?" Lucille looked down at it thoughtfully. "Evidence." The word detonated through the ceremony. Richard Hale stepped forward sharply. "You will not embarrass this family publicly." Lucille slowly lifted her eyes toward him, then calmly said the sentence that finally shattered whatever illusion remained. "You should have thought about that before your son embarrassed me privately." No one moved. No one breathed. Even the photographers stopped shooting for one suspended second. Because suddenly everyone understood the bride was no longer heartbroken. She was prepared. And Weston Hale had absolutely no idea how much damage Lucille Bishop was about to do. Lucille slid one finger beneath the envelope seal, then looked directly at Sabrina. "Would you like to know how long I've known about you?" Sabrina's lips parted slightly. Weston whispered Lucille, "Don't." But she already was. The envelope opened with a soft tearing sound that somehow echoed louder than the guests whispering around them. Lucille reached inside calmly. Weston stared at her like he no longer recognized the woman standing across from him. Maybe he didn't, because the version of Lucille who begged quietly for honesty was gone now. What remained was someone far more dangerous. Someone who finally stopped protecting the people hurting her. Lucille pulled out several folded papers, phone screenshots, bank transfers, printed emails. Every carefully organized detail looked devastatingly ordinary in her hands, and that was the terrifying part. Betrayal rarely looked dramatic up close. It looked administrative, calculated, documented. Lucille Weston said quietly, panic bleeding into his voice now. "Please stop. Please." Again. Funny how powerful men suddenly discovered humility when exposure entered the room. Lucille ignored him. Instead, she turned toward the guests. "I spent weeks asking myself one question," she said softly. "How does someone betray you this completely while still expecting your loyalty?" No one answered. No one could. Lucille lifted the first page. "This," she said calmly, "is a hotel receipt from Boston last November." Weston closed his eyes briefly. Sabrina stared at him. Lucille continued. "Weston told me he was attending a medical conference." She looked directly at Sabrina. "You posted photos from the same hotel rooftop that weekend." Sabrina's face changed instantly. Confusion? Realization. "You checked my Instagram. I checked everything." Weston stepped forward sharply. "This is insane." "No," Lucille replied quietly. "This is organized." A few guests shifted uncomfortably now. Others watched with horrifying fascination. Because nobody expected the bride to arrive emotionally armed. Lucille held up another document. "This one's interesting." Richard Hale's expression darkened immediately. "Lucille, no Richard. You should hear this too." She unfolded the paper carefully. A private investment agreement connected to Hale Medical Group's expansion merger. Weston's face drained of color. "There it is. Fear. Real fear this time. You used my law firm connections to secure investor confidence before the merger announcement," Lucille continued. "The engagement boosted public trust in the company image." Several hospital board members exchanged uneasy looks instantly. Richard stepped forward aggressively. "That information is confidential." Lucille tilted her head slightly. "So was your son's affair." Silence exploded again. Evelyn looked like she might faint from humiliation. Good. Lucille had spent years quietly bleeding inside rooms exactly like this while these people protected appearances over humanity. Now they could bleed publicly. Weston lowered his voice urgently. "We can fix this." Lucille almost smiled. The arrogance. Even now he still thought the problem was the scene, not the betrayal itself. "You don't understand yet," Lucille said softly. "There's nothing left to fix." Then she reached back into the envelope and removed her phone. Weston physically stiffened. Oh yes, now he was afraid. Lucille tapped the screen once. A recording began playing through the microphone system connected to the ceremony speakers. Evelyn's voice filled the garden instantly, clear, cold. If Lucille keeps asking questions, Weston needs to control the situation before the merger closes. Gasps erupted across the audience. Evelyn's face went white. "That recording is illegal." "You knew," Lucille interrupted quietly. The next part of the recording played. Richard's voice this time. "The marriage stabilizes investor confidence. Weston can deal with his personal mess later." A woman near the front row whispered, "Oh my God." Weston looked genuinely horrified now, not remorseful. Exposed. There was a difference. Lucille shut the recording off slowly. The silence afterward felt enormous. Evelyn looked at her son desperately. "Say something," Weston finally snapped. "What do you want me to say?" The outburst shocked everyone, even him. Years of polished composure cracked visibly down the middle. Lucille watched carefully. Interesting. The real Weston only appeared once control disappeared. Sabrina looked devastated now. "You told me you were trapped," she whispered. "You said she was cold and emotionally unavailable." Lucille laughed softly under her breath. "There it is. The classic script. Weston turned toward Sabrina sharply. "Not now!" "No," Sabrina snapped suddenly. "Actually now!" For the first time since arriving, Sabrina sounded angry instead of heartbroken. Good. Lucille wanted them both fully awake for this. "You told me she didn't understand you," Sabrina continued. "You said the marriage was basically business." Lucille folded her arms slowly. "Was that before or after he slept with you in our apartment?" Sabrina froze. Weston looked physically sick. "Oh my God," Sabrina whispered. Lucille nodded calmly. Exactly. The cruelty of him finally became visible in full daylight. Not romantic cheating, not tragic confusion, consumption. Weston consumed women emotionally and expected gratitude afterward. Richard stepped closer now, lowering his voice dangerously. "You are jeopardizing multi-million-dollar negotiations." Lucille met his gaze evenly. "And your son jeopardized my life. This can still be contained." Contained, like she was a scandal instead of a human being. Lucille suddenly felt exhausted. Not emotionally, spiritually. Tired of men discussing damage control while women carried actual damage. She slowly removed the engagement ring from her finger. The movement silenced the garden instantly. Weston noticed immediately, and panic flooded his face completely. Lucy. No performance left now. No charm. Only fear. Lucille held the ring between her fingers thoughtfully. "You know what's tragic?" she asked quietly. Weston looked shattered already. "You really believed I'd rather protect your reputation than protect myself." The sentence landed brutally hard, because it was true. That's exactly what he believed. That Lucille's kindness would always outweigh her self-respect, that she'd keep absorbing pain privately forever. Lucille looked toward the guests, then toward Sabrina, then finally back at Weston. "You didn't betray me once," she said softly. "You betrayed me every single day you woke up beside me knowing the truth." Weston's eyes filled with desperation. "I love you." Lucille shook her head slowly. "No, you loved being forgiven." Silence. Pure silence. The kind that changes rooms permanently. A phone buzzed suddenly somewhere near the front rows. Richard checked it quickly, and his face lost all color. Weston noticed immediately. "What?" Richard lowered the screen slowly. "The hospital board. Emergency meeting request. Investor concerns already spreading online. News photographers had begun uploading images from the ceremony. Fast. Too fast. The merger was collapsing in real time." Richard looked at Lucille with genuine hatred now. "You planned this." Lucille stared back calmly. "No," she said quietly. "Weston planned this the first time he decided I would tolerate anything." Then she stepped backward slowly away from the altar. Away from Weston. Away from the future she almost destroyed herself trying to preserve. Weston reached toward her instinctively. "Lucille, please don't walk away like this. Like this. Again. Always worried about appearances." Lucille looked at him one final time, then softly delivered the sentence that finally broke him completely. "You should have thought about that before you built a life that depended on my silence." And across the garden, while cameras flashed and wealthy guests whispered in horror, Weston Hale realized the woman he underestimated most had just destroyed everything standing behind him. Nobody moved after Lucille stepped away from the altar. The entire garden sat frozen beneath white roses and shattered illusions. A wedding designed to celebrate power had turned into public execution, and the silence afterward felt almost holy. Weston stood motionless near the altar, staring at Lucille like he still believed he could somehow pull her back into the life he destroyed. But Lucille felt strangely calm now. Not happy, Not triumphant, just free. Years of emotional confusion had disappeared the moment truth entered daylight. Because manipulation only survives in darkness. The second people see it clearly, it starts dying. Guests whispered nervously across the ceremony rows, while photographers continued snapping pictures with cautious excitement. A scandal like this would spread through Manhattan before sunset. Lucille knew that. And for the first time, she didn't care. "Lucille!" Evelyn Hale's voice cut sharply through the silence. Lucille turned slowly. Evelyn walked toward her with the rigid posture of a woman desperately trying to maintain dignity while everything burned around her. "You've embarrassed this family enough. There it was again. Not my son betrayed you. Not are you okay? Only reputation. Only image." Lucille looked at her quietly. "Enough?" Evelyn straightened. "Yes." Lucille laughed softly. The sound carried through the silent garden like broken glass. "You let your son cheat on me for years." Evelyn's expression hardened instantly. "Marriage is complicated." "No," Lucille replied calmly. "Loyalty is simple." Weston finally stepped forward. "Mom, stop." "Interesting." "Too late, of course. But interesting." Evelyn ignored him completely. "You could have handled this privately like an adult." Lucille stared at her in disbelief. Privately? Again. Women were always expected to suffer privately so powerful men could continue publicly. Something inside Lucille finally snapped completely. "No," she said sharply. The force in her voice startled everyone, including herself. For years, Lucille had swallowed pain politely, made herself softer, smaller, easier to love. But standing here now beneath thousands of white flowers, while the people who destroyed her still demanded grace, she suddenly felt furious, real fury, the kind women buried for entire lifetimes. Lucille stepped closer to Evelyn. "You don't get to ask me for dignity after your family stripped me of mine." The words cracked through the garden. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Lucille kept going. "No more pretending," she said, voice trembling now with emotion. "No more polished lies. No more sitting silently at your dinner table while everyone treats me like I should be grateful for emotional scraps." Weston looked devastated. "Good." Lucille turned toward him finally. "You know what the worst part is?" He swallowed hard. "I loved you enough to keep doubting myself every time you hurt me." Tears burned behind her eyes now, but she refused to look away. "I kept thinking if I became easier, calmer, prettier, less emotional, maybe you'd finally choose me the way I chose you." The guests watched in complete silence. No whispers now, only raw attention. Because suddenly this wasn't entertainment anymore. It was recognition. Every woman in that audience knew some version of this pain. Weston stepped closer desperately. "Lucy, please, no!" Her voice broke sharply. "No more asking me to protect you." The sentence visibly hit him, because that's exactly what he'd been doing for years, asking her to protect his comfort at the expense of her reality. Lucille wiped tears from her face angrily. "I defended you to everyone," she whispered. "I defended you while you were sleeping with another woman." Sabrina looked physically ill now, standing several feet away. "Good. Let her hear it too." "I lost myself loving you," Lucille continued. "And the sickest part," her voice cracked harder, "you noticed." Weston's face collapsed. Because he had noticed. Of course he had. He saw her exhaustion, her insecurity, her emotional starvation, and instead of loving her better, he used it. Lucille laughed bitterly through tears. "You knew I would stay. That's why you kept pushing the line further." "Lucille, no!" she shouted suddenly. The force of it stunned the garden silent again. Even the birds near the lake seemed to stop moving. Lucille stared directly at Weston while years of suppressed pain finally surfaced. "You taught me that my loyalty meant less to you than your convenience." Weston looked shattered now, actually shattered, not performative, not polished, human. But Lucille realized something heartbreaking in that moment. His pain still centered around loss. Not accountability, he was grieving consequences, not her suffering. "You taught me survival by trying to break me," she whispered. The sentence hung heavily in the warm afternoon air. Several guests visibly looked away emotionally. Olivia was crying openly now near the front rows. Claire stood beside her with clenched fists and furious eyes. Evelyn folded her arms tightly. "You're being dramatic!" The cruelty of the statement almost stunned the audience. Lucille slowly turned toward her. "Dramatic." Her voice dropped dangerously quiet. "I found out the man I was about to marry built a second relationship during our engagement while your entire family protected him." She stepped closer. "You don't get to call my pain dramatic because it makes you uncomfortable." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "You're emotional." "Yes," Lucille snapped. "That's what betrayal does to people." Then suddenly, Lucille smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, the kind of smile that appears right before truth becomes irreversible. "You know what's funny?" Nobody answered. "I spent years thinking your family was intimidating." Her eyes drifted slowly across Richard, Evelyn, and Weston. But standing here now, Lucille's voice steadied completely. "You all look incredibly small." Richard stepped forward furiously. "That's enough." Lucille reached into the envelope again. Richard immediately stopped moving. Fear. Interesting. Lucille pulled out her phone once more. One last thing. Weston's expression changed instantly. "Lucille, don't. Too late." She pressed play. Evelyn's recorded voice filled the ceremony speakers again. "If Lucille becomes difficult, Weston needs to remind her how much she benefits from this marriage." A horrified murmur spread through the guests. Then Richard's voice followed. "She's emotionally attached. She won't leave." The recording ended. Pure silence followed. Lucille looked directly at Evelyn. "You didn't just know about the affair." Her voice turned razor sharp. "You all underestimated me together." Weston closed his eyes like the words physically hurt. Good. Let them hurt. Lucille slowly slipped the engagement ring completely off her finger. The massive diamond caught sunlight one final time. Then she placed it carefully on the altar table beside the untouched vows. "I would rather be alone," she said softly, "than loved like this." The sentence broke something inside the entire garden, because everyone understood the truth buried inside it. Love without respect becomes emotional imprisonment. Weston looked at the ring like someone watching his entire future collapse physically in front of him. Then finally, his voice cracked. "Please don't do this." Lucille looked at him calmly through tears. "I already did." And for the first time in his life, Weston Hale realized love could leave him too. The moment Lucille turned away from the altar, the entire illusion collapsed behind her. Not the wedding, the fantasy, the carefully constructed image of Weston Hale as the perfect man, the obedient silence expected from Lucille, the untouchable power of the Hale family, all of it cracked open beneath sunlight and white roses. Lucille stepped down from the ceremony platform slowly, the train of her wedding gown dragging across stone pathways lined with horrified guests. Nobody stopped her. Nobody knew how. Weston finally moved. "Lucille." His voice echoed sharply across the garden, desperate now, human now. Lucille kept walking. He caught up quickly, grabbing her wrist near the edge of the aisle. "Please," he whispered harshly, "don't leave like this." Like this. Still those words. Still obsessed with appearances. Lucille looked down at his hand gripping her arm, then slowly lifted her eyes to his. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. And suddenly she saw it clearly. Weston genuinely never believed she would leave him. Not really. He thought she'd cry, scream, threaten, then eventually forgive him again because she loved him more than herself. That was the tragedy of women who overgive. People start believing your survival instincts no longer exist. Lucille gently pulled her wrist free. "You spent years teaching me my pain mattered less than your comfort," she said quietly. "You don't get to ask me for softness now." Weston's eyes filled with panic. "Lucy, I'll fix this." "No," she whispered. "You'll manage it." The difference shattered him, because she finally understood him completely. Weston didn't repair damage. He controlled fallout. Lucille stepped backward again. Then, without another word, she bent down slowly and removed her heels. The movement confused the crowd instantly. Olivia gasped softly. Claire looked emotional immediately because she understood what it meant. Lucille held the expensive white heels in one hand while standing barefoot in the middle of the destroyed ceremony. And somehow, she had never looked more powerful. The grass beneath her feet felt cold and real, not polished, not curated, real. For the first time in years, Lucille felt grounded inside her own body again. Weston stared at her like he was losing something he couldn't replace. Good. Let him finally feel unstable, too. Behind them, Sabrina still stood near the aisle, looking emotionally wrecked. Mascara smudged, hands shaking, reality finally settling in. Lucille turned toward her quietly. Sabrina looked up immediately. "I didn't know," Sabrina whispered, and for the first time, Lucille believed her. Not everything, but enough. Enough to recognize another woman manipulated by the same man. "You knew he was engaged," Lucille said softly. Tears slipped down Sabrina's face. "He said you stopped loving him." Weston closed his eyes painfully. Lucille laughed once under her breath. Of course. The emotionally neglected man narrative. Ancient, predictable, dangerously effective. Sabrina wiped tears from her face angrily. "He said he felt trapped." Lucille nodded slowly. "And now he is." The sentence landed brutally. Weston looked physically ill. "Good." Sabrina suddenly turned toward him with raw fury. "You let me humiliate myself for you!" Weston ran a hand through his hair desperately. "Sabrina, no," she snapped. "You told me she was temporary." Lucille watched Weston carefully now. No charm left, no polished confidence, only collapse. And strangely, she no longer hated him. Hate required emotional attachment. This felt emptier than hate. It felt finished. Richard Hale stormed toward them, then face dark with rage. "Every photographer in New York is uploading this disaster." There it was again. Disaster. Not betrayal, not emotional destruction, public embarrassment. Lucille suddenly felt exhausted by wealthy people, by their inability to recognize humanity once status entered the room. Evelyn approached more carefully this time. "Lucille," she said quietly, "you're emotional right now." Lucille looked at her, really looked at her, at the woman who spent years teaching her silence disguised as elegance. Then Lucille smiled sadly. "No," she replied softly, "I'm finally honest." The sentence silenced Evelyn completely, because deep down, she understood. Lucille turned toward the guests one final time. Hundreds of eyes stared back at her, some horrified, some sympathetic, some deeply uncomfortable because truth had entered a place built entirely on performance. Lucille inhaled shakily, then spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I spent years trying to become someone easier to love. Complete silence. I thought if I gave enough, supported enough, forgave enough. Her voice cracked briefly. Eventually, I'd feel chosen. Several women in the audience visibly teared up because they understood. God, they understood. Lucille looked toward the lake beyond the ceremony garden. But love that requires you to abandon yourself isn't love. The wind moved softly through her veil. And I would rather disappoint people than spend another year disappointing myself. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Weston looked destroyed by the truth in her voice. Lucille finally stepped away from the ceremony aisle entirely. Claire immediately reached her first, wrapping both arms around her tightly. Lucille almost collapsed emotionally from the relief of being held without conditions. "You did it," Claire whispered through tears. Lucille closed her eyes briefly. "No," she whispered back. "I survived it." Olivia joined them seconds later, crying openly now. "You terrifying, beautiful woman." Lucille laughed weakly through tears. The first genuine laugh she'd had in months. Behind them, chaos exploded fully. Guests arguing, phones ringing, publicists panicking, hospital executives whispering furiously around Richard Hale. Weston stood alone near the altar, watching Lucille walk farther away from him with every second. And for the first time in his life, nobody was helping him control the narrative. Noah Bennett approached quietly from the edge of the garden. He looked at Lucille carefully, not pitying, not intrusive, just present. "You okay?" he asked softly. Lucille considered the question honestly, then surprised herself with the answer. "Not yet." Noah nodded once. "That's fair. No pressure. No manipulation. No demand for emotional management. Just space. God." Lucille suddenly realized how exhausting Weston had always been. How much energy she spent monitoring his moods, protecting his ego, shrinking herself to keep peace. Love shouldn't feel like emotional labor. The realization nearly broke her again. Suddenly, photographers surged closer toward the pathway entrance. Questions exploded loudly. "Lucille, did Weston Hale cheat during the engagement? Are the merger allegations true? Did the Hale family know flashbulbs lit the garden aggressively?" The scandal had already escaped containment. Social media would devour this within hours. Lucille looked back one final time. Weston stood beneath the floral altar alone now, his tuxedo wrinkled, his face pale, the untouched wedding vows beside him, and for one dangerous second, he looked exactly like the man she once loved. Broken, lost, human. The sight almost hurt. Almost. Then Lucille remembered the years of lies, the manipulation, the loneliness, the way he came home from another woman's bed and still expected tenderness from her. And just like that, the pity disappeared. Lucille lifted the edge of her wedding dress carefully and continued walking barefoot away from the ceremony, away from the performance, away from the life that nearly buried her alive. And behind her, Weston Hale finally understood the terrifying reality of losing a woman who no longer wanted to be convinced to stay. By midnight, the wedding scandal had already reached national gossip sites. By morning, it reached medical journals. By Monday afternoon, Weston Hale's career began collapsing in real time. Lucille watched it happen from the quiet corner office at Mercer and Goldstein, while rain streaked softly across Manhattan windows. Cardiac surgeon exposed in wedding scandal. Hospital merger under investigation after public affair revelation. Bride publicly confronts elite medical family. Every headline felt surreal, not because it hurt, because none of it belonged to her emotionally anymore. For the first time in years, Lucille sat at her desk without monitoring someone else's mood, without waiting for disappointment, without preparing herself emotionally to be neglected. The silence inside her life felt unfamiliar, but peaceful. Diane entered the office carrying 2 coffees and several printed reports. "Well," she said calmly, "the Hale family is currently experiencing what legal professionals call catastrophic consequences." Lucille almost smiled. Almost. Diane sat across from her. "The merger board suspended negotiations this morning." Lucille nodded once. "Not surprised. Richard Hale is threatening litigation against half the press. That'll help." Diane laughed softly, and Weston's hospital placed him on temporary administrative leave pending internal review. That one landed differently. Not satisfaction, sadness. Because once upon a time, Lucille would have destroyed anyone who threatened Weston professionally. Now she just felt tired. "He did this to himself," Diane said carefully, reading her expression immediately. Lucille stared out the window. "I know, and she did. That was the hardest part. Nobody ruined Weston except Weston. The affair wasn't the destruction. The entitlement was. The belief that he deserved endless forgiveness without accountability. That's what finally destroyed him." Diane leaned back quietly. "You know what your biggest mistake was?" Lucille looked over. "What you loved him. Like he was emotionally fragile while he treated you like you were emotionally disposable." The sentence hit painfully because it was true. Lucille spent years cushioning Weston from discomfort while silently enduring her own. Never again. Meanwhile, across the city, Weston sat alone inside the penthouse staring at his phone while missed calls flooded the screen. Hospital board members, investors, public relations firms, Richard, Evelyn, even Sabrina. Everyone wanted answers now. Nobody wanted him. The apartment felt unbearably silent without Lucille there. No coffee brewing in the mornings, no soft music while she worked late nights. No quiet presence moving through rooms making the place feel alive. Weston suddenly realized something horrifying. Lucille had been carrying the emotional warmth of the relationship almost entirely by herself. Without her, everything felt cold. The penthouse looked luxurious now, but empty. Weston rubbed both hands over his face exhaustedly. His reflection in the dark television screen looked terrible, unshaven, pale, human. For years, Weston believed Lucille would always remain emotionally available no matter what he did. That was the danger of unconditional loyalty. People start viewing it as permanent. His phone buzzed again. Mother. Weston ignored it. 30 seconds later, Richard called. Ignored again. Then finally, Lucille's contact appeared accidentally while scrolling through messages, and Weston physically stopped breathing for a second. Their old conversations filled the screen. Tiny things. "Did you eat today? Good luck in surgery. I'm proud of you." God! She loved him everywhere. In every ordinary moment he barely appreciated. Weston suddenly threw the phone across the room violently. The sound shattered against marble floors. But the guilt stayed. 3 days after the wedding, Sabrina left New York. Lucille learned that through Olivia, who learned everything through gossip chains faster than journalists somehow. She dumped him publicly at some restaurant in Tribeca, Olivia said over lunch. Lucille raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's dramatic." Apparently she threw a glass of wine at him first. Lucille looked down at her salad to hide the faint smile threatening her face. "Good for her." Olivia studied Lucille carefully. "You okay?" Lucille considered the question honestly. Still strange, still painful, still humiliating sometimes. But underneath all of it, lighter, I think I forgot what peace felt like, she admitted quietly. Olivia reached across the table. That's because you spent years surviving emotionally. The sentence lingered heavily. Surviving emotionally. Yes, that's exactly what loving Weston became eventually. Not partnership, survival. A week later, Lucille returned officially to full-time work. And for the first time in years, she stopped leaving the office early to accommodate someone else's schedule. No rushing home, no emotional management, no pretending exhaustion was romance. Just work, focus, herself. Co-workers treated her carefully at first. The scandal had spread everywhere. But something unexpected happened too. Women started approaching her quietly, in elevators, conference rooms, bathrooms. One woman whispered, "I wish I'd left my husband years ago." Another said, "You were brave." A third simply hugged her silently. Lucille realized then that public truth scared people because it forced them to confront their own private unhappiness. That was why women like Evelyn protected appearances so fiercely. Because once one woman leaves, others start imagining freedom too. 2 weeks after the wedding disaster, Noah Bennett showed up outside Lucille's office carrying coffee. Lucille blinked in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Noah shrugged casually. "You stopped answering everyone's messages." "I've been busy. You've been hiding. Fair." Lucille accepted the coffee slowly. Noah leaned beside her office doorway comfortably. No pressure, no emotional performance, just presence. "How are you really?" he asked softly. Lucille looked down at the cup, warming her hands. "Some days I feel strong, and other days humiliated." Noah nodded once. "That's normal." Lucille laughed quietly. "I exposed my fiancé in front of 200 people and half the internet. And sometimes I still wonder if I was too cruel." Noah stared at her in disbelief. "Lucy." She looked up. "A man cheated on you for years, used your career for financial leverage, manipulated another woman simultaneously, and let his family emotionally dismantle you." He stepped closer slightly. "You didn't ruin his life." His voice sharpened carefully. "You stopped sacrificing yours to protect it." The words hit hard, because deep down, Lucille still carried guilt. Women were trained to. Even after betrayal, they still worried about being too harsh. Noah studied her quietly for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You know what I think?" "What I think Weston underestimated the quietest person in the room." Lucille laughed for real this time. A small, genuine sound. Noah's expression softened immediately hearing it. And suddenly Lucille realized something strange. Being around him felt easy. No tension, no emotional calculations, no fear of saying the wrong thing. Just ease. God. Healthy attention felt almost unfamiliar now. That evening, Lucille returned to her apartment and found a handwritten envelope resting against the concierge desk. No return address necessary. She already knew. Weston. Her chest tightened instinctively before she even opened it. Funny. How the body remembers emotional danger before the mind does. Upstairs, Lucille sat alone by the window while city lights glowed softly beyond the glass. Then finally unfolded the letter. The handwriting looked shaky, unsteady, unlike Weston. The first line immediately hit her chest hard. "I finally understand what it feels like to lose you." Lucille closed her eyes briefly, because for the first time since the wedding, Weston sounded honest, and somehow that hurt more than the lies. At the bottom of the letter, one sentence stood alone. "Please let me explain everything properly." Lucille stared at the words for a very long time, then finally reached for her phone, and against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him one last time. The cafe Weston chose sat quietly on the corner street in Brooklyn, far away from hospitals, investors, and people who recognized them from headlines. Rain tapped softly against the windows the afternoon Lucille arrived. For a moment she stood outside beneath her umbrella, staring through the glass. Weston already sat inside waiting, and somehow he looked older. Not physically, emotionally. The polished confidence he carried for years had disappeared completely. No tailored arrogance, no effortless charm. Just a tired man sitting alone with both hands wrapped around untouched coffee. Lucille inhaled slowly before stepping inside. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly. Weston looked up immediately, and the expression on his face nearly broke her heart. Not because she still loved him, because grief looked so human, stripped of ego. "Hi," he said quietly. Lucille nodded once and sat across from him. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt enormous now, not angry, just finished. Weston stared at her carefully. "You look different." Lucille almost smiled. "So do you." He gave a weak laugh under his breath. "Fair." Outside rain blurred passing traffic into streaks of silver and gray, while soft jazz played through hidden speakers overhead. Once upon a time this setting would have felt romantic. Now it felt like closure. Weston rubbed his hands together slowly. "Thank you for coming." Lucille looked down at the menu she had no intention of reading. "You said you wanted to explain." Weston exhaled shakily. "I don't even know where to start. The truth usually helps." The sentence landed harder than she intended. Weston nodded slowly. "You're right." Silence again. "Then finally, I never meant for things to go this far." Lucille almost laughed. "Of course. Men always said that after detonating someone's life, as if betrayal simply wandered too far accidentally. You cheated on me for 3 years," she said quietly. "That's not losing control for one night, Weston." His eyes dropped instantly. "I know." "No," Lucille replied softly. "I don't think you do." Weston looked genuinely devastated hearing that. Good. For years he treated understanding like a burden Lucille owed him automatically. Now he could sit inside misunderstanding instead. "It started during residency," he admitted quietly. "Sabrina was easy to talk to. Easy." Lucille remembered how difficult she became after years of emotional neglect. How often she cried privately, how exhausted she looked. Funny how women became difficult once they started reacting to pain. She made me feel... Weston hesitated. "Admired," Lucille suggested calmly. He looked up sharply. "Yes." Lucille nodded slowly. "Of course. Weston always needed admiration more than intimacy. That's why he loved being wanted more than being accountable." "I kept thinking I'd end it," he whispered. "But you didn't." "No." Because consequences hadn't arrived yet. Lucille understood that now. Weston's loyalty lasted only as long as comfort remained uninterrupted. The waitress arrived briefly to take orders. Lucille requested tea. Weston asked for nothing. After she left, he looked back at Lucille carefully. "I did love you." There it was. The sentence she once would have sacrificed everything to hear sincerely. Now it only made her sad. Lucille folded her hands quietly in her lap. "You loved me the way selfish people love good women," she said softly. Weston flinched visibly. "You loved how much I forgave." The rain outside intensified slightly. "You loved how safe I made your life feel." Lucille's voice stayed calm. But love that only survives when one person keeps swallowing pain isn't love. Weston looked completely shattered now. "I know that now." "Do you?" Lucille studied him carefully. For the first time since the wedding, she realized something important. Weston genuinely didn't expect to lose her. Not truly. He expected consequences, anger, temporary distance, but not permanent absence. Because Lucille had always stayed before, that was the danger of repeatedly forgiving someone. Eventually, they stop seeing your love as a gift and start seeing it as your identity. Weston stared down at the table. When you walked away from the altar, his voice cracked slightly, I realized I built my entire life around the assumption that you'd never leave. The honesty surprised her. Lucille looked out the window quietly. You know what's tragic? Weston lifted his eyes slowly. You didn't lose me that day at the altar. Silence. You lost me every single time you chose yourself over me. The sentence landed between them heavily. Final. Weston closed his eyes briefly, like it physically hurt. Because deep down, he knew exactly how many moments she meant. Every dismissed feeling, every lie, every dinner where he watched Evelyn humiliate her silently. Every night, Lucille cried alone while he texted another woman. Death by 1,000 tiny betrayals. I hate myself for what I did to you, Weston whispered. Lucille believed him. That was the sad part. He finally understood her value once losing her became irreversible. Too late. Always too late. You know what I realized after the wedding? Lucille asked quietly. Weston shook his head. I wasn't grieving you. He looked confused. I was grieving the version of myself that accepted less than she deserved. The truth of it settled softly between them. Lucille took a slow sip of tea after the waitress returned. Warm, grounding, real, unlike most of her relationship with Weston eventually became. I kept asking myself why I stayed so long, she admitted quietly. Weston looked devastated hearing it phrased that way, and Lucille smiled sadly. Because I confused being needed with being loved. Weston leaned back like the words punched through him. Lucille continued softly. You only became affectionate when you felt me pulling away emotionally. His silence confirmed everything. You never fought for me when things were easy, she whispered. Only when consequences arrived. Outside thunder rolled faintly through the city. Weston's eyes filled slowly. Is there truly no chance for us? The question hung painfully in the air. Lucille looked at him for a long moment, and suddenly she felt nothing complicated anymore. No fury, no desperate love, no confusion, just clarity. She cared about him, maybe some part of her always would, but caring and returning were not the same thing. Lucille set her teacup down carefully. I forgive you. Weston's face lifted instantly with fragile hope. Then she continued, but I can never trust you again. The hope disappeared immediately, and this time, Lucille didn't rush to comfort him. That was new too. You taught me something important, she said softly. Weston swallowed hard. What? Lucille stood, slowly gathering her coat. That self-respect feels lonely at first. Her voice gentled slightly, but eventually it feels peaceful. Weston looked up at her like he wanted to memorize every detail before losing her forever. I'm sorry, he whispered, and maybe for the first time in years, he meant it completely. Lucille nodded once. I know. Then she leaned down slightly and kissed his cheek softly. Not romantically. Like goodbye. Like mourning. Like closure. When she pulled away, Weston's eyes were wet. Lucille almost cried too. Not because she wanted him back, because healing sometimes hurts more honestly than heartbreak. She turned toward the cafe door, then paused one final time. Without looking back, she said quietly, one day you'll understand that loyalty was the rarest thing I gave you. And then Lucille Bishop walked out into the rain, smiling gently for the first time in years. Not because her heart never broke, because it finally belonged to her again. 1 year later, Lucille Bishop no longer checked her phone, wondering who might disappoint her. That alone felt revolutionary. Morning sunlight poured through the oversized windows of her Boston apartment, while soft jazz played from the kitchen speakers and fresh coffee filled the air. The apartment wasn't enormous, wasn't extravagant, but every single corner belonged entirely to her. No emotional tension lived here, no silence heavy with resentment, no pretending, just peace. Lucille stood barefoot near the balcony wearing an oversized sweater while autumn leaves drifted through quiet streets below. For the first time in years, her nervous system had finally learned how to rest. Healing, she discovered, wasn't dramatic. It happened slowly, in ordinary moments, in mornings without anxiety, in dinners eaten alone without loneliness, in laughter that no longer felt forced. After the wedding scandal, Lucille transferred to her firm's Boston office and rebuilt her life carefully from the ground up. New city, new routines, new boundaries. Most importantly, a new relationship with herself. Therapy helped. Long walks helped. Learning how to exist without constantly earning love helped most of all. At first, the silence after Weston felt unbearable. Lucille had spent so many years emotionally orbiting another person that she barely recognized herself without someone else's needs consuming her. But over time, she started returning. Piece by piece, she began painting again, reading novels for pleasure instead of distraction, calling Claire just to laugh, saying no without guilt. God, that one changed everything. No without apology, no without panic, no without explaining herself into exhaustion. Lucille smiled softly while pouring coffee into her favorite ceramic mug. The mug had tiny gold lettering across the front. Softness is not weakness. Olivia mailed it to her 3 months ago. Lucille used it every morning, a quiet reminder. Kind women were not foolish. They were simply taught to survive by overgiving. And now Lucille was learning something entirely different. Reciprocity. Noah Bennett arrived around noon carrying pastries from the bakery downstairs. He knocked twice before entering. "You still forget to lock your door," he said casually. Lucille looked up from the kitchen island. "You still let yourself in like you pay rent." Noah grinned. "Emotionally, I contribute a lot." Lucille laughed. A real laugh. Easy. Natural. Noah paused briefly, hearing it. Not because it was rare anymore, because it still felt beautiful every time. Over the past year, Noah became a quiet constant inside Lucille's life. Never pushing, never demanding, just showing up consistently, helping her move apartments, bringing soup when she got sick, listening without trying to fix her emotions. It amazed Lucille sometimes how healing simple emotional safety could feel. Noah set the pastry box down. "You ready for tonight?" Lucille groaned dramatically. "Do I have to go? Yes. I already survived one wedding catastrophe. This one hopefully contains less public emotional destruction." Hopefully, Lucille shook her head, laughing. Tonight was Olivia's wedding. Small, elegant, healthy. The words still felt strange. Healthy love, healthy communication, healthy commitment. For years, Lucille thought love required endurance. Now she understood real love should feel safe enough to rest inside. Noah leaned against the counter, watching her quietly. "What, you seem lighter." Lucille looked down at her coffee. "I am." And she meant it. Not because life became perfect, because she stopped abandoning herself trying to keep relationships alive. That changed everything. The wedding venue overlooked the Charles River, glowing beneath thousands of golden lights. Soft piano music drifted through the ballroom, while guests laughed warmly around the candlelit tables. completely different from the Hale wedding. No performance, no status competition, just joy. Lucille stood near the back entrance for a long moment, absorbing the atmosphere carefully. A year ago, weddings made her chest tighten painfully. Now there was still sadness somewhere deep inside her, but no fear, no grief, only memory. "You okay?" Noah asked beside her softly. Lucille nodded slowly. Yeah, and surprisingly, she was. Olivia spotted her immediately and rushed over in excitement. "You came legally obligated." Olivia rolled her eyes before hugging her tightly. Then she pulled back and studied Lucille carefully. "You know what's weird, what? You actually look peaceful now." The statement hit harder than expected because Lucille realized something heartbreaking. For years, nobody used words like peaceful to describe her. Only patient, supportive, understanding. Code words for emotionally overextended women. But peaceful, that was new and precious. The ceremony began shortly afterward beside enormous windows overlooking the water. Lucille sat quietly while Olivia walked down the aisle glowing with genuine happiness. No fear, no emotional confusion, just certainty. The contrast nearly made Lucille emotional. When the groom saw Olivia, his face transformed completely. Not performative admiration, not ownership, wonder. The kind Weston never looked at Lucille with near the end. Not because Lucille lacked value, because Weston stopped seeing value in anything he already possessed. Lucille understood that now too. Some people only appreciate devotion once they lose access to it. Halfway through the vows, Noah's hand brushed lightly against hers. Not possessive, not demanding, just there, an offering, a choice. Lucille looked down at their hands briefly, then slowly intertwined her fingers with his. No panic followed, no emotional exhaustion, just warmth. Simple, safe. Tears filled her eyes unexpectedly, not from sadness, from relief, because she finally understood healthy love doesn't make you fight for basic dignity. It protects it naturally. After the ceremony, guests gathered beneath hanging lights while soft music floated through the reception hall. Lucille stepped outside alone briefly onto the terrace overlooking the river. Cold autumn air touched her skin gently. The city lights shimmered across dark water below. A peaceful silence settled around her. Then Noah appeared beside her, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "Thought you might disappear out here." Lucille accepted the glass softly. "Needed air." Noah nodded knowingly. For a few moments they simply stood together quietly. Comfortable silence. Another thing Lucille once thought impossible. "You know, Noah said eventually I almost called you after the wedding 100 times. Lucille smiled faintly. "What stopped you? I figured you spent enough years with someone trying to control your emotions." The sentence settled warmly inside her chest. Noah looked at her carefully. "I wanted you to choose your own healing." Lucille stared at him for a long moment, then softly asked, "And if I hadn't?" Noah shrugged lightly. "Then I still would have respected you." God. The gentleness of that nearly broke her heart. Lucille looked back toward the glowing ballroom behind them, people laughing, dancing, loving each other openly, and suddenly she realized something profound. She no longer wanted revenge, not even a little, because revenge required staying emotionally attached to the wound, and Lucille had finally healed enough to choose something better. Peace. She leaned lightly against Noah's shoulder while soft music drifted into the night air, then quietly whispered the truth that took her years to learn: love should never cost your dignity. Noah kissed the top of her head gently, and this time Lucille didn't feel like she was begging to be chosen. She simply felt loved. Sometimes the most painful heartbreaks are not the ones where someone leaves us suddenly, but the ones where we slowly abandon ourselves trying to keep someone else from leaving. Lucille's story is not just about betrayal. It's about what happens when a kind person keeps shrinking their needs to make love easier for someone else. So many people are taught that loyalty means enduring pain quietly, that being understanding means tolerating disrespect, that forgiveness must come before self-respect. But real love should never require you to disappear. A healthy relationship does not make you question your worth every day. It does not punish you for having emotions. It does not ask you to carry the entire emotional weight alone while the other person keeps taking and taking without accountability. One of the hardest lessons in life is realizing that some people only appreciate your value after losing access to you. Not because you were hard to love, but because they became too comfortable receiving your love without earning it. And sometimes walking away is not weakness. Sometimes it is the first act of self-respect. Lucille didn't become powerful the moment she exposed Weston at the altar. She became powerful the moment she stopped begging to be chosen by someone who repeatedly chose himself over her. That's the real healing. Not revenge, not humiliation. Peace. The kind of peace that comes when you finally understand your softness was never the problem. Your kindness was never weakness. Your love was never too much for the right person. The right love will never ask you to sacrifice your dignity to keep it alive. If this story touched you in any way, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved to finally save yourself? And if you enjoy emotional stories about healing, betrayal, self-worth, and powerful new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey.